Thank you for joining me. I want to talk a little bit today about the well-known American legal theorist Ronald Dworkin, who passed away relatively recently, and especially about his views on individual rights and collective interests. These views were most fully developed by him in his famous work, Taking Rights Seriously. And although that work is a little bit dated in the conversation now, nevertheless its influence has been so vast and important that it is worthwhile for us to briefly pause and recollect precisely what exactly his views of rights and collective interests were. And I'm going to conclude the video by talking a little bit about some criticisms that might be launched against Dworkin's views from the perspective of another well-known legal theorist, Robert George, a professor at Princeton University. At any rate, for starters, Dworkin conceives of individual rights as being fundamental and as being derived from an abstract right to equality. Being fundamental, they cannot be overridden by governments except in extraordinary circumstances, and as such, they are worthy of great respect. Now, precisely what respect means in this context is best illustrated by virtue of comparing individual rights over and against collective interests. For Dworkin, individual rights ought to trump collective interests. That is, they ought to take precedence over collective interests. In circumstances in which collective interests might dictate that a particular policy or proposal be pursued, nevertheless, if those collective interests come into conflict with individual rights, then for Dworkin, the individual rights ought to take precedence over the collective interests. Now, as a conventional liberal in the 20th century, Dworkin holds the view that government, as far as possible in the Western liberal democracies, ought not to be predicated, and its policies ought not to be based on any controversial understanding of the human good. Instead, as much as possible, governmental policies ought to be loosened from those controversial foundations and instead predicated on principles or ideas which are shareable by all. And for Dworkin, an abstract right to equality is indeed one of those shareable conceptions which all persons in liberal democracies are capable of endorsing. Now, Dworkin conceives of collective interests primarily in terms of utility. The utilitarian view, classically, at least in its classical foundations, was an understanding of collective interests that asserted that all human beings are acting rightly and do act rightly and ought to act rightly if and when they act in a way that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number of people. And usually that meant happiness understood in terms of pleasure. Promoting the greatest good for the greatest number of people, though, is not for Dworkin enough justification to override the individual rights of persons. Suppose that you or I, say, has an individual behavior that we want to pursue that's an important part of our particular worldview. Suppose it's something that's controversial, such as drug use. And suppose that society collectively would be better off if its members weren't using the kinds of harder drugs that are possible to obtain these days on the street. Even in the presence of the greater good of society and the collective interests that could be advanced by virtue of banning drug use, Dworkin thinks that if that drug use is an important part of your worldview or my worldview, the liberal position suggests that society ought not to override your individual rights or my individual rights. Instead, it ought to defer to those rights as being fundamental and taking greater precedence than society's own goals or policies. Now, Dworkin is often criticized for being a kind of a rights fundamentalist. That is, he's someone who into every conversation by asserting that rights are what they are and cannot be questioned and cannot be overridden, even if the cause is quite great or quite good or quite important. And here we might find a criticism of Dworkin, one that many have raised, including Robert George. It is not clear where Dworkin's abstract right to equality, so central to his book Taking Right Seriously, actually comes from. Why should we believe that human beings have an abstract right to equality? Yes, it is a shared intuition that many modern people have. At the same time, though, it is not necessarily something that Dworkin can justify by virtue of appealing to any deeper philosophical foundation. And here perhaps we could criticize Dworkin for simply positing something that, and then asserting that we all agree that there is such a thing, namely an abstract right to equality from which he derives such other derivative rights as a right to privacy or a right to equal concern and respect. Dworkin, we could say, by way of criticism, is simply positing this and assuming that an audience will agree with him. And this kind of begs the question because he never actually demonstrates the efficacy or the value or the justification of such an abstract right to equality. Moreover, Dworkin also could be criticized and has been criticized by Robert George and others for arguing that for assuming that the collective interests that our individual rights ought to take precedence over are utilitarian collective interests. There are lots of other ways of conceiving of collective interests, ways that perhaps are immune to some of the criticisms that Dworkin raises against collective interest type thinking, including especially natural law views, views that conceive of basic goods as being incommensurable, and being incommensurable themselves inviolable. And if a community is seeking a basic good and pursuing a basic good in accordance with a particular policy aim, then it is very fast and loose to assert that those basic goods can be brought into a calculus of interests that can then be weighed and measured off and balanced off over and against individual rights if they are fundamental as basic goods, and if the principles by which we interpret them are also fundamental. Then on the conservative natural law criticism, it is very hasty for Dworkin to treat them as though they were utilitarian collective interests. So there you have it, Ronald Dworkin's views on individual rights, views that have been very influential. He is a kind of a rights fundamentalist. Very famously, he asserted always and everywhere individual rights and individual conceptions of the good, though they may be self-destructive, nevertheless take precedence over community interests, collective interests, precisely because it is the individual who should chart his or her own way, and liberty for the individual ought to be inviolable, even over and against very great community goods which could otherwise be achieved.